If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what is the most eerie and terrifying thing you've witnessed but no one believes you saw? When I was around 15 or 16, I was staying at a friend's house. His parents were out, and we were babysitting his little brother for the night. His family lived on the top floor, and his grandparents lived on the bottom. It was a huge farmhouse, so it was still a big house. We got to bed late, and at one point I woke up in the night to the landing light on, the bedroom door open, and a very thin, pale woman with very curly dark hair standing there, looking at us. I figured his parents came home early, brought a friend with them, and went back to sleep. In the morning, my friend asked me if I saw the woman last night. I said yes, and we went out into the house to see if his parents were home. Nope. His grandparents were still asleep, and the house was locked tight. Really freaking weird. We even asked his parents if they came home and went out again because it was so weird that we both saw that woman. They'd been out all night. The area was weird, though. My mom had grown up on the next farm and was terrified of the place because weird stuff kept happening. Everyone said it was haunted. He lived next to a disused railway line where there were no longer any tracks, and people kept seeing the train and seeing a man hanging there. This happened to me relatively recently, 3 years ago. I was in my mom's guest room. It was in the middle of the night. Something woke me up. I saw a shapeless, tall, dark figure with long dark hair at the bottom right of the bed, next to the door. I turned a little bit my head to the right as it came closer to my right. I could see the bookshelves and the dark thing, like a shadow but more consistent, in front of them. I couldn't see details or a face. I immediately felt intense terror and wished to take my phone off the night table that I was clearly seeing. But I couldn't move. I was totally paralyzed and felt as if something really heavy was on me. I couldn't scream either. It lasted a few minutes, then the dark shape moved towards the door and vanished. Immediately after that, I could move and breathe normally, and the terror passed. I took my cell phone, which was at the same place, and put on the flashlight. The room was normal. Except that the door was open a bit. I always sleep at my mom's house with the door closed because of her cat. So that's truly what happened. Most people just said I was having a nightmare. But it didn't feel like any nightmare that I had. I was seeing the room as it is and felt awake. My mom told me the day after that I experienced a dark spirit trying to possess me. She believes in good spirits, or angels, and bad spirits, or souls. I was terrified to sleep there again for a while. Only months after someone told me that I may have experienced sleep paralysis plus awakening dreams. About a year ago, my brother and I were reading an article on the internet at around 1 a.m. My parents are asleep in their bedroom, which is right next to mine. All of a sudden, we hear the loudest, most blood-curdling scream coming from outside. No joke, this scream filled me with instant, unfathomable dread. My parents' bedroom door shook violently as if it had just slammed shut. This, of course, causes my parents to jolt awake in a panic. We all run over to the window near the source of the scream, and we see a woman with long hair and a white dress slowly walking up the street, crying and occasionally letting out a loud scream. My dad rushes outside and asks her what's wrong or if she needs help, but she just keeps walking. Dad decides to call the police anyway. When they arrive a few minutes later, they find no sign of the woman. Also, I recently heard the same scream at around the same time of night, although it didn't wake up my parents this time, and I was too scared to look out that window. I'm still not sure what I was witnessing. In high school, me and a buddy made the dumbass decision to smoke weed in a graveyard around 8 to 9 at night. It was summertime, so it was just now getting dark. I smoked to the point of being totally out of it. We were just chilling next to a tree when I saw a man walking down the graveyard. I got a little nervous immediately, but I blew it off. I then see the man pull out a handgun and aim it at something. He didn't notice us at this point, and I couldn't see who or what he was aiming it at. I was so terrified I thought I was mildly hallucinating. I couldn't even move. My friend hit my side and said, "Dude, this guy has a ducking gun out. We've got to get the duck out of here." We both slowly got up, but like the stoned idiots we were, we hit a rock trying to get up, and the man finally noticed us. He was a good 200 feet away from us, but the second he saw it, he slowly moved towards us with the gun in his hand. We started running at this point. I looked behind my shoulder once and saw him start to run towards us as well. We booked it out of the graveyard and were finally back in my neighborhood. I was terrified for days after that. I was 12 years old, this was back in 1985, and a few of the streets near where I lived were still dirt roads. We lived near a Catholic church, and there is a fair every year in January. Me and an older friend were walking towards the fair at around 7 p.m. It was already quite dark. All of a sudden, as we crossed the corner and started walking on the dirt road, my friend just froze. "What is it?" I asked. He got so pale and stammered. In front of us, a couple of feet away, there was something that was really hard to describe. It was dark, but this was darker than the darkness, which is the only way I can find to describe it. It was a woman, buried from the waist down, wailing. Her wailing somehow, though near us, was heard in the distance. Both my friend and I immediately thought about La Llorona, which is a ghost or apparition that usually haunts places with water nearby. It is said that her wailing can be heard far away when she is near and near when she is far away. We both started running towards the church, which must have been half a mile away or so. As I turned back, I could see her slowly crawling out of the ground. I stumbled but regained my footing and kept running behind my friend. We were both shaken up and unwilling to walk back home until my parents showed up. Since then, a couple of times at night, even as the roads are now paved and there is street lighting, sometimes when I visit the folks, I hear the dogs howl a couple of times in the middle of the night. Some friends that still live in the old neighborhood say they can still hear her sometimes. When I was a preteen, I liked to rearrange my room a lot. This one particular time, I moved my bed up against my wall, facing the door to the hallway, and then I put the TV on the adjacent wall, facing at an angle so I could see it head on from my bed. Well, one night I had my light on and was watching a show. I go to turn the light off and lay in bed. I then noticed on the one wall in the room that was blank a shadow of a figure with a head and almost a full set of shoulders. It was about halfway up the wall, a little taller than I was at the time. I was just staring at it. I couldn't move. I finally got the courage to get up a little bit and see if anything was casting a shadow, but since I just rearranged the room, there was nothing between my TV and my bed. I put my hand out, and it cast a shadow next to my head. I put my head up, and it cast a shadow on the wall next to the other shadow too. But that shadow didn't move. I finally got up and turned the light on, then back off, and the shadow was gone. Craziest thing ever. I immediately switched rooms again and never saw it happen again. This happened to my friend's aunt and uncle. They lived out in the country, off of a country road. The next closest house was a quarter-mile away, and on either side of the house were cornfields. Middle of nowhere, even for Nina. It was late at night, and both of them were asleep. There are no pets or kids in the house. Now, you know that sensation when you have your eyes closed in the dark and someone turns a light on and you can see the light faintly through your eyelids? That happened to the wife and woke her up, and when she opened her eyes, there was a man standing in the doorway of their room, towards the foot of her bed. He was just standing there, flipping the lights on and off. On, then off. The wife started to nudge the husband awake while he was completely shocked in fear. Right as she started to get him awake, the dude flipped the lights on, smiled and paused briefly, then flipped them off. Pitch black. Then the guy simply walked out of the house. I never found out who the guy was or what he wanted. He cut the screen door to get into the house. The police never figured it out either. My friend's aunt is still in therapy today because of it. I was sitting on a recliner in my living room at 3 a.m., watching a horror movie. I was covered in a soft blue sheet, which laid pretty flat because I was pointing my toes forward. Suddenly, my dog's tail starts to rise from underneath the blanket, which creates a sort of tent at the edge of the recliner. I say to my dog, "What are you doing there, weirdo?" I don't let them near recliners because a puppy had clipped his ear near one and I didn't want to repeat, and I lean over to look at him. I look over the edge of the recliner, and suddenly the sheet drops flat on my body. My dog is across the room, sleeping quietly with my other dog. I calmly turn off the TV, go to my room, and sleep. Some 20 years ago, I was living near the Canadian border alone in a rented log cabin. It used to be part of a fishing resort and had been renovated since it was built in the early part of the century. The cabin was approximately half a mile from the nearest neighbor and 15 miles from the nearest town, so I had gotten used to isolation fairly early on. At the time, I was working PM shifts at a resort 25 miles away and wouldn't typically get home until well after midnight. On this particular night, I had gotten home, put on pajamas, and gone into the kitchen area to wash dishes. I was standing in front of the sink, looking out the window onto the woods, when directly behind me, just above the height of my head, there was the sound of a man's whistling. Just 2 notes, and then nothing. I positively froze. I looked into the reflection of the window in front of me and saw nothing. Very quietly, I wrapped my hand around a totally inadequate knife that was in the sudsy water and turned around. There was nothing there except for my 2 cats sitting by the wall, looking directly into the air behind me, where the whistling had come from. This kicked off many extremely odd experiences in that cabin that continued until I moved out some 6 months later, but that one was by far the most shocking just because it was completely unexpected. I spend a great deal of time alone in isolated locations, but since that evening I have thought long and hard about what it means to be a woman alone in the woods from a safety perspective. Back in 2008, I was 15, and I lived on a 300-acre ranch in a small town in Idaho. I lived in a 5-bedroom, 3-bath 1980s cheaply built home with my parents and sister. My 6 older brothers had already grown up and moved out. Yes, I know, big family. My sister and I slept in the bedrooms upstairs, just down the hall from my parents' room. Her room was directly across from mine. That year I started having nightmares about dark figures, and then I would wake up around the same time every night, 3 a.m. Well, one night I wake up, look out into the hallway, and a dark figure walks past my door. I blinked a few times, decided I was dreaming, and went back to sleep. The next day I moved my bed so when I woke up I wouldn't look out the door into the hallway, thus making it harder to imagine things walking by in the night. So 3 a.m. comes around again, and I wake up to a woman's voice singing this high-pitched eerie song right next to my ear. There was this dark, heavy feeling in the air, and I stopped breathing. The singing continued, and then ever so softly, I felt someone or something playing with my hair. Softly running its hands down my red hair. I closed my eyes and said a silent prayer because I was too terrified to speak a word out loud. As soon as I finished praying, the song stopped, and I heard a scream fade away. The next day I told my mom about the experience, and she dismissed it as a dream. I forced myself to believe her. It had to be a dream because if it were real, I wouldn't ever be able to sleep again. Dream or not, I moved my bed back to where it had been the night before. 3 a.m. came around again, and suddenly I found myself awake staring at the dark hallway between mine and my sister's rooms. That's when a dark, slender figure walked in between our rooms and stood in the hallway. It turned its head and looked into my sister's room and then into my room. Back into my sister's room and then turned to look back into my room again. My heart was pounding through my chest, and all I wanted to do was scream, but I couldn't. I was so scared that I froze. The figure paused and almost smiled. It wasn't a smile because I couldn't make out its face, but it was like it knew it had me. Then, just as I was gathering the courage to scream, the figure got down on its hands and knees and started crawling into my room. I screamed the most pathetic scream of my life and yelled, "There is something in my room." My parents flipped on the lights and came running into my room to find nothing. To this day, my parents say I was dreaming. I switched rooms after that, and even now I refuse to sleep in that room when I visit my folks. I don't know what I saw or what happened, all I know is that it did happen. A lady who works with my mom told us this story one day when they came over for dinner. We had been talking about creepy movies, and she decided to tell us about some of the weird stuff at their new place. They had just bought a house in the Wilmington, North Carolina, area, moved in, and everything was going fine until one day she opened the silverware drawer and found a tooth sitting on top of the silverware. It was weird, and no one knew how it got there, but they threw it away and tried to get on with their lives. A couple of weeks later, it happened again. Open the silverware drawer. Now it's super weird, but again, the tooth gets tossed out and ignored. It kept happening. Over the next 6 months, they kept finding teeth every couple of weeks. They got a home security system with motion detectors and cameras and stuff because they figured they had a particularly sick prankster in the area, but even though they kept finding teeth, the system never detected anyone leaving them. One day, she's at home and gets a call from her husband telling her to get out of the house right then because the security alarm went off, saying that all of the doors and windows had just opened at the same time. She left for a few hours, but nothing had opened or closed. Finally, they got fed up and went to talk to the lady who had sold them the house. She still lived in town and had built a house that was almost an exact replica of the one they had sold to this couple. That in itself was a little weird, but she completely refused to talk about the previous house and shut the door in her face when they asked about it. They're not happy, but weird stuff is only happening every few weeks, so it's not enough to drive them out of the house or anything. The last incident that I know of was about a month or 2 ago. She went down to the basement to do the laundry, and when she opened the dryer, there was a tooth sitting on top of the clothes. She says that she felt something cold hit her in the face, almost like getting hit with a pillow, and blacked out. Her husband found her a little while later, thrashing around on the floor. They called the paramedics, and she came back around and was fine. That was the end of the story. There has been no resolution, no explanation, and no other weird stuff lately. It was the freakiest thing I'd ever heard. I was going through a rough breakup in 2005 and liked to take nightly walks in the December snow. Never anything special, it was usually around 10 or something, and I'd go around the block real fast. Milk run stuff. But one night, I got maybe 40 feet away from my house to the intersection, where I was just hit with this massive wave of terror and dread. My throat clenched up, I got horrible goosebumps, and my eyes started tearing up slightly. I was caught off guard and looked around. There was absolutely nothing I could see anywhere. Nothing in the cloudy sky, nothing in the road, I couldn't see anything in the bushes. Just boom, terror. I thought it was weird, but I went right back home, scared and confused. I kept looking out the windows until I went to bed, and I never saw anything. To this day, I wonder what happened or was prevented. I was 12 years old, and we were 3 kids sharing 2 bedrooms. So my dad decided to put up a half wall to make a third. If I stood on my bed, I could see into my brother's room. We were young and used to throw a ball before falling asleep. One night I was just drifting off when my mom tapped me on the shoulder and said, "PSSST. What are you doing?" I thought, that's a very weird question, obviously I'm sleeping. So I turn around to answer her, but it's not my mom. It's not a person. It looked like a 3D shadow of a man. Just black. I screamed while my eyes were closed, and the figure disappeared. My mom and dad came running into my room. I told them everything. They thought it was just my imagination, but tell me if I'm scared to go to sleep in the room with my brother. I tried to sleep, but I was shaken. My brother woke up once to go use the bathroom upstairs, and I pretended I was asleep. I didn't want him to know I was still afraid. I hear him go into my room, right next door, climb on the bed, springs, and then just stop. I thought he was trying to purposefully scare me, so I looked up to show him I was awake and saw the figure again. Arms crossed, with its head resting on his hands. Even though it had no facial features whatsoever, I knew it was looking at me. I try to convince myself it's just dark, it's my brother playing a prank, and I'm seeing things. Then I heard the toilet flush upstairs. It was just that one night. I never saw anything like it again, or even close. Where I grew up, there's a road called Indian Cabin Road. It's a long road that intersects several other roads, eventually going from pavement to dirt after a bit. You eventually end up near a river in another town, but for a while you drive through the woods with no guidance except for the dirt road since no phones get signal out there. Being from a small town, every kid knows about it. It's almost a rite of passage. I 100% know that if I were to walk up to any local at a Wawa and ask about Indian Cabin Road, they'd immediately say, "Yeah, that place is haunted," and leave it at that. So anyway, my best friend and I decided to find it and drive down there the night of Halloween. After searching our maps and finding the street it forked off of, we drove down in her Caprice, thinking all the while, why the duck did we choose the worst car in the world to go off-roading? She's a firm believer in the supernatural, so the whole time she's playing up the fact that it's Halloween and we're driving down the most haunted road in our town. I'm rolling my eyes, trying not to laugh, because, duck it, it is Halloween, and I might as well enjoy the supposed spookiness of it all. We end up driving most of it without realizing it until we reach the part where the road is essentially a dirt pathway. Not even 10 minutes later, my friend inexplicably stops her car and says that she doesn't want to drive down anymore because her car can't handle it. Before I can even reply, I hear her say, "What the duck is that?" in the most bone-chilling, terrified voice I have ever heard in my life. In the tree line, there's what only I can describe as this spinal skeleton thing staring at us with glowing red eyes. It was on all fours, but its body was stretched out so that its back legs were bigger than its front. It was pitch black outside at this point, but both her high beams and headlights were on, so I am 100% certain it was not a human in a morph suit, an animal, or anything in between. It stared at us, this inky black creature, and started to move towards us. In high-stress situations, I usually end up laughing to calm my fears, and at this point, I started chuckling, telling her it was just a wolf and nothing to be afraid of. My friend immediately booked it out there, repeatedly asking me what it was and what was happening. All I kept saying, all I could say really, was, "It's just a wolf." I was legitimately scared, and to this day, I have no idea what the duck we saw. We haven't driven down there since, and my friend repeatedly brings it up whenever I mention that I don't believe in the supernatural. This is from when I was a little boy, living with my grandma on our farm at the time. The farm had been around for a very long time, and we had lived on it for around 10 years. I was living with my grandma there, and we were the only two who lived in the house, along with our 2 dogs and the cat. This house was huge. 6 bedrooms, 2 kitchens, 2 full bathrooms, a basement, and of course, 3 living rooms. Now my grandmother would sleep on the first floor in her master bedroom, and I would sleep upstairs in the playroom, if you will. One night I was upstairs asleep with my dog Sam and our cat. Sometime in the night, I woke up to the sound of someone walking up the stairs. I thought it was my grandma coming up for some reason, so I just closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep. We had wooden stairs, so the footsteps were rather loud, and I slept with the door open. I swear I heard these footsteps coming up the stairs for at least 10 minutes and started freaking out in my head. I looked around the room and saw my dog passed out on the floor and my cat asleep at the end of the bed, both of them clearly not hearing what I was hearing. All of a sudden the footsteps stopped, and I was relieved but still had a pounding heart. A couple minutes later, I heard a pair of footsteps coming up the stairs, 2 pairs of feet, and this time a little louder. I was really scared now, and I obeyed the law of if I am under my blanket and can't see it, it can't hurt me, so I shut my eyes harder than ever and just stayed very still. I was like this for what seemed like hours but in reality was probably only a couple minutes, and again the sound stopped for a brief moment. Now is when I should say that outside my door in the hallway was carpeted, and the next sound I heard is what freaked me out the most. I heard the sound of someone coming towards my door and a dragging foot. I think I only tolerated this for a few seconds before losing my calm. I called for my dog, who awoke, and told him to follow me. With him at my side and holding his collar, I walked down to my grandma's room, turned on all the lights, and slept with her that night. I never heard anything again, but I did hear other ghostly stories from people who had stayed in the house over the years. This is the story I like to tell people who say they are afraid of the dark. 2008, Northern Ohio. My cousins invite me out to go on a camping trip to some hidden state park or whatever, and I happily agree because, hey, Ohio has to be better than Indiana, right? So I drive out to their house, and we pack up our tent and food and head out in his truck for a few hours into the boondocks. After miles of twists and turns, the road gets bumpy, and I wake up and am off the grid, like a dirt road and grass off the grid. We park the truck and head up into the hills for a couple of miles, making base camp at the top of a hill overlooking a valley with thick trees on the edge across from us. Nightfall comes fast, and around 1 or so around the fire, I ask the park's name. Well, they break out into laughter and say it's not a park but native land and we were camping upon some sacred hill. I call bullshit, but they name a tribe, which at the time sounded legit enough to not argue against. A few minutes later, we hear this scream that just drifts across the hills and right to our bones. We all grew up hunting, have been around the country, and have had our fair share of animal calls and howls, but none of us could agree upon what they were. If anything, I would say a screaming fox, but deeper, and a wolf because of how it carried. This goes on a few more times, and the laughter soon becomes uneasy, and it seems to be getting closer. The 5th scream sounded like it was coming from down in the valley, so we all looked over in that direction, and I don't care if you don't believe in this SHT, but I do to my death. Out of the ducking tree line, we see what looks like a gangly, thin, naked man who, from this far away, seems way too tall for normal. This thing takes off in a sprint on 2 legs at us, and without hesitation, all 3 of us run off the hill and into the woods towards the car. Being at night only made this escape more terrifying. As we reached the bottom of the hill, we heard the scream again, this time from where our camp was. We neither turned back nor checked to see if the others were near us. After the fastest 2 miles of my life, we get in the truck, floor it off the land, and drive to the nearest McDonald's, where we sit until dawn with no words to each other. We agreed to go back in the morning to grab our things. We do, and to our surprise, nothing has moved or been taken, which seems weird because if someone was ducking with us, they would have trashed the place or at least taken a few things. We drove back to my uncle's, where we tried to joke about it and just move on. This SHT didn't bother me until I saw my friend play until dawn, and I became uneasy because it looked like what we saw. The SHT is real and out there. This happened when I was about 12 years old. I was living with my mom in the house of her then boyfriend. One night, I'm sleeping, but I wake up, I have no idea what time it was, and I see something beside my bed. It's kind of crouching and looks like a person, and I realize that it looks like my mom, and it's dressed in the clothes she would wear when she was going to bed, so a tank top and shorts. I guess the thing realized I was awake? And looked towards me. I didn't understand what was going on, so I pulled the covers over my head. After about a minute, I peek out, and that thing is still crouching beside my bed, but this time it's holding the lamp from my bedside table, and it looks like it's offering it to me. Like you know when someone is holding something out to you and kind of motions it towards you to take it, I guess? My 12-year-old ass is like, duck this is not my mom, and I start screaming. I see the thing's head whip towards the bedroom door, and I think I closed my eyes for a second. I hear a thud, and then the ceiling light gets turned on, and mom's boyfriend is in the middle of my room looking panicked, shortly followed by mom, who is looking very tired and confused. I definitely saw him enter first and her follow. The lamp was on the floor, and the crouching thing that looked like my mom was gone. I still don't know to this day what that was, and it's been over 10 years. There was a graveyard that had a gravestone that looked like it would glow at a certain angle. This was a popular local thing, It would be common to show up at the graveyard at night and have a bunch of people there to see it. One night, while myself and another friend were there, some sketchy guy, who looked homeless, said that the ghost of the girl who was buried at the glowing gravestone had been seen recently. My friend and I both looked at each other like whatever, but we stayed because we had nothing better to do. About 10 minutes later, a family shows up, husband, wife, and 3 kids, all under the age of 10-ish. They're standing next to us, we're all waiting for something to happen. We're standing about 20 feet away from the gravestone, and there are no lights around, so it's dark. I then think I see a small shadow figure, blacker than the darkness around us, walking around the gravestone. I don't say a word to anyone. It then looks like it stopped and knelt down beside the gravestone. As soon as this happens, the creepy homeless guy leans over to me and very quietly says, "Do you see it kneeling down?" At this point, I freak out. Not more than 30 seconds later, the mother of the family skips over to the gravestone and starts to skip around it. We're all in shock, her kids are bawling their eyes out because they're totally creeped out, her husband keeps calling her name, she just continues to skip around. She stops, walks over back to where her family is standing, and acts like nothing ever happened. She finally sort of snaps out of it, and her husband asks what the heck that was all about, and she claims she has no recollection of what happened. At this time, myself and my friend are completely freaked out and have decided it's time to get the hell out of there. I definitely saw a shadow. I don't know what to think about that mother skipping around. I wouldn't think she would freak her kids out to the point of crying just to prank a few people. I moved into a basement apartment and lived there for 2 years to save money. After a week or so, I kept waking up at night around 3 a.m., and immediately my eyes would zoom into a corner of the room for no discernible reason, and the nightmare started. I would dream of the corner of the room, and I started seeing something demonic and terrifying crouched in that corner as it leered at me. I would wake up screaming and could not tell reality apart from my dream. I started always sleeping with a nightlight on. Slowly, I started sleeping more and more when I was home, but whenever I was out of the house, I was totally energetic and able to focus, but as soon as I came inside the house, specifically my bedroom, I and others would suddenly become lethargic, depressed, and unproductive. I never told anyone what I was experiencing, but people who visited me would tell me they would get a bad feeling in my room. Even people who didn't believe in paranormal stuff would say that. I wondered if it was carbon monoxide poisoning, but the sensor never went off. After a few more months, I started waking up in the middle of the night for no reason and having this strong feeling that someone was watching me. Around this time, my recurring nightmares of the demonic being changed to a recurring and pleasant dream of a nice-looking young man in a dark suit who I'd never seen before in real life and whose face did not look familiar to me from TV or something. He would usually be standing very far away from where I was standing. He would smile gently at me and wave me over to him, and I would start walking towards him. However, I never actually reached him and would wake up before I got within arm's reach of him. I just chalked all of this stuff up to stress disturbing my sleep and my dreams being weird manifestations of my stress. But then I started babysitting my friend's 2-year-old daughter, and that is when I started getting kind of freaked out. One night, the baby and I were laying on my bed as we waited for her mom to come pick her up when suddenly she turned to the corner and started giggling. Then she started saying hi. Very excitedly and waving. I was creeped out, but I figured it was just her being a kid and having a wild imagination. I peeked over and saw nothing in the corner, turned my back to it again, and faced the baby and watched her. She was legit smiling, laughing as if someone was making a funny face at her, and waving to the corner of the room. Then my heart dropped when she started babbling as if having a conversation with someone, all the while she was staring at something in the corner. At this point, I picked her up and took her out of my room because I was so freaked out. As I carried her out, she started saying bye to whatever was there. After this incident, whenever I would wake up with the feeling of being watched, I started seeing a shadowy shape a few feet away from me. As the weeks went on, the shape felt like it was getting more opaque and taking on the form of a silhouette of a man. My first thought was that I was hallucinating and freaking myself out. Yet I kept seeing this shadowy outline, no matter what I told myself. I was terrified, no matter how logically I tried to approach the situation. The little girl I babysat would still come over and occasionally say hi to random areas of the room, and whenever she heard a noise like a creak, if she happened to be in my room, she would always immediately look over to the corner of the room. I just tried to be logical about it, but it still freaked me out when she would do that. Then one night, I was having my usual pleasant dream of the strange man who would wave me over. This time, as I was walking over to him, something felt off, and right as I was within arm's reach of him, something screamed at me to stop, and when I looked at his face, it morphed into something so utterly horrific and demonic that I woke up screaming. Again, I saw the shadowy form standing a few feet away from me, and I could feel it staring at me. I was utterly terrified, but my mind was telling me it was just a dream or remnants of a sleep paralysis experience, but my body was pumped full of adrenaline and so taut as if I were being hunted. It's a strange thing when your mind and body are at complete odds with each other. At this point, I was terrified I was losing my mind and maybe experiencing some early symptoms of a mental breakdown or illness like schizophrenia or something. I had to have been hallucinating, and I even considered going to a therapist. I was terrified to go to sleep at night and started keeping all the lights on all the time. In any case, a few weeks later, I made up my mind that I needed to move the duck out of that place after the little girl, who was now 3 years old, suddenly walked into my bedroom and started crying in fear for no reason. After that, whenever she heard noises, she would start whimpering in fear as she clutched at me and refused to go into my room. A few months after this, I moved the duck out, and I could not believe how different the first night at my new apartment felt. A few months later, I talked to the landlady of the basement apartment I had moved out of. She was a family friend, and suddenly confessed to her about all this stuff I had been experiencing in the place she had rented out to me. It was the first time she had ever heard any of it, and she started telling me it must have been my imagination. The landlady's daughter was there with us, and that is when we were both shocked as her daughter told us that apparently she was friends with the previous tenant, and the lady was super into the occult and wanted to be a witch. The previous tenant would regularly hold seances to communicate with the dead and regularly use Ouija boards to communicate with the other world. The lady would also have magical rituals to call on spirits to help her with whatever she needed help with. I was just shocked into silence. Last I heard, the landlady put a few Bibles and crosses in the apartment and burned sage in there. Anyways, I've never felt that kind of dread since I left that place. Never have those freaky dreams again. I never dreamt of that man in the dark suit again, who would beckon me to him. I never saw a shadowy figure again looming near me as it watched me sleep. I've never had the feeling I was being watched since I left. I am sure there's a rational and logical explanation to it all, but I just will never forget that sense of dread and primal fear and the dark feeling that something was trying to crawl and claw its way into my mind that I would get while living in that place. I used to do hauling for a friend's ghost hunting operation. We had a case to go to in a fairly well-known museum here in Florida. Touristy schlock, yet the building has a long history. We got everything set up and started out. They got up to the 3rd floor, and I heard loud laughter. Man's voice, knowing no one had that voice in the group, 2 guys, 3 girls. He heard a scuffle and yelled up, asking if everything was okay over the radio. They said they had an issue with one of the girls, let's call her Jane. In a flash, they had gotten her down to ground level and out the front door, where she collapsed after a huge struggle to get her out. I had no idea what happened. We packed up and hauled asses. Later on, when I reviewed the tape, the smallest girl started laughing in a super deep manly voice, started trying to jump off the walkway they were on to a 3-story drop, became cold, was talking in tongues, and was apparently really heavy as they had to struggle to get her out. The video and audio freaked me out. We all signed an NDA, as the landowner did not want anything about the case getting out that would bring negative light to their building. I was on a bunch of investigations, started my own hunting group here in Florida, that has since been stolen from me, and have seen and heard tons of fun shit. When I was about 13, my dad bought the house where this kid died in. He died riding his bike on the highway just down the road. He lived in the shed, converted to a room, bathroom, bedroom, drum set, etc. It was a pretty sweet setup, and once we moved into the house, that's when it happened. My brothers and I lived in a room facing the shed, and one night we heard drums playing like a steady beat with cymbals coming from the shed. We laughed it off at first, like, hey, we're crazy, just a joke, but after a while we started thinking this was weird as shit, so we manned up and walked out there. About halfway there, it stopped and it started to rain. A little cliche, but duck, it was creepy. So we decided to finish out our quest. We used the flashlight to sweep the room, and we came up to this dead kid's drum set, and we saw a shadow of a duckin' dude sitting on the drum stool. We hauled asses out of there, got back inside, and didn't say a word. It was the weirdest SHT I saw. When I was about 13, my dad bought a house. Years before, a kid lived there, and he died riding his bike on the highway just down the road. He lived in the shed, which had been converted into a room, bathroom, bedroom, drum set. It was a pretty sweet setup. After we moved into the house, something happened. Both mine and my brother's bedrooms faced the shed, and one night we heard drums playing a steady beat with cymbals. We laughed it off at first, thinking, hey, we're crazy, it's just a joke, but after a while, we started thinking this is weird as shit. So, we manned up and decided to walk out there. About halfway to the shed, The drumming stops and it starts to rain, a little cliche, but, duck, it was creepy. Instead of turning back, we decided to finish out our quest. We walked into the shed. There were no sounds, nothing, it was dead quiet, no pun intended. We used the flashlight to sweep the room, and we lit up the drum set. In the shadow, we saw a person sitting on the stool. My brother and I hauled asses out of there, and when we got back inside, we didn't say a word. That was the weirdest thing I have ever seen. I ducking tried, man. In the old town of Wheat, Tennessee, now a part of Oak Ridge, there is an old white church, the George Jones Memorial Baptist Church. The church was abandoned, along with the rest of the town, in preparation for the Manhattan Project. The church still stands as a historical site today. As the stories go, the basement was a hotbed for ritualistic activity. There have been multiple accounts of people messing around on the grounds and having spirits follow them home. A friend of a friend claims to have gone there and then gone home, only to have his bedroom closet door slam open that night. I planned a trip with my girlfriend about a year ago. We love checking out abandoned locations like that. Not sure what to expect, we parked in front of a gate on a gravel drive leading up to the church. We walked around the gate, ignoring the keep out signs. It was late at night, so we figured we'd be undisturbed. Using our flashlights, we walked along the path until we saw the church and graveyard in the distance, lit by a single streetlight. Upon getting to the church, we see that the door is boarded and locked with a padlock protected by some welded sheet metal to prevent the lock from being cut. Walking around the building, we saw the tall windows were boarded up about 3/4 of the way, so we could not see anything but the ceiling inside. The back door, leading to the basement, was also boarded up from the inside, apparently preventing any entry that way. We resigned ourselves to spending some time in the graveyard. We walked through, reading the headstones and taking pictures. Nothing was really out of the ordinary except that in one of the pictures there was a weird shadow in front of one of the headstones, but that could have just been a lens thing. What really freaked us out was that we heard footsteps on the gravel pathway. We were sure we'd been caught and were going to get into some kind of trouble for trespassing. We decided to try and get back to the car. On the way, there was a large limb fall out of a tree some 30 feet away. Maybe it was a coincidence. Since the area was pretty heavily wooded, the path was our best bet to get back, so we resigned ourselves to taking it to get back to the car. The strangest thing of the entire visit was that we clearly heard footsteps on the gravel but did not see anyone on the way back to the car. I'll be going back with a method of removing the padlock so that we can check out the inside of the church at some point. It's just too enticing to leave alone. My mom moved us into a new home. She was in the living room trying to hook up the cable, and I was in her room roughly 10 feet away. She kept asking me to turn the TV on to see if it connected, but every time I turned it on, there was loud static. When I turned the TV off after another unsuccessful attempt, there was a large, solid black human-like figure standing behind me in the reflection of the TV. I was facing the only entrance, and I was 100% alone in that room. It was the middle of the day, but all our curtains were closed, so it wasn't a reflection from outside. I ran like hell, and when I told my mom, she didn't believe me. My brother and I consistently had experiences over the many years we lived there. Every single night, you would hear and feel someone running back and forth down the hallway. My brother and I were across the hall from each other, but we were on the opposite side of the house from my mom, behind a closed door with our only pet, a dog, R.I.P. So many nights, we'd both look out our doors at the same time to see if it was the other person, but nothing. We learned to live with it because it never stopped. Another time, in broad daylight, I watched my dog walk into a room we used as storage in the same hallway. I laughed and went down the hall to get him out, saying something like, "Silly boy, you can't go in there," but when I turned into the room, it was empty. I was super weirded out because I watched my entire dog walk in. When I got back down the hallway, I saw my dog through our glass door, fast asleep on the patio. There was no exit point from that room except a window that wouldn't really open, so it stayed closed and locked. I have so many other stories, but when my brother and I moved out, my mom finally agreed that the house was haunted. She woke up in her room to a dark, human-like figure standing over her. When she turned the lamp on her nightstand on, it was gone. My grandmother lives in an old Victorian house that has many flights of creaky stairs. On multiple occasions, I swear to God, I have seen a young boy running up and down these stairs. The creepiest experience with this was when I was house sitting for her. One night at about 3 a.m., I woke up and went down the stairs to the kitchen to get a glass of water. I never bothered to switch on any of the lights in the hallway and walked straight into the kitchen, where I did switch on a light. I poured myself a glass of water when, all of a sudden, I got a really horrible feeling of terror. I then began to hear the stairs start creaking, almost like someone was walking down them. This terrified me, as I knew there was no one else in the house. So after a few minutes of freaking out, I mustered up the courage and walked out of the kitchen. As I looked at the stairs, I saw a smiling child's face staring directly at me. I froze in fear, and after a few seconds, it had completely disappeared. After seeing this, I turned all of the lights on in the house, watched TV, and never went to sleep that night. Another strange thing that happened was when I and one of my cousins were staying at the house with my grandmother when we were in our teens. My grandmother was out shopping when, really out of the blue, my cousin decided to go for a walk. This was strange as she never really wanted to go on walks. I brushed this off and continued to do whatever I was doing when, again, just like I previously discussed, I got a sudden feeling of dread and terror. This time the feeling was much stronger. It was so strong and disturbing that I had an extreme urge to get out of the house. I felt as if I was being forced out of the house. I caught up to my cousin and explained what happened, and she said she had the exact same feeling as me. We were both terrified and nearly in tears. We didn't go back to the house for a couple of hours. A few friends and I were driving around in the middle of the countryside in Wisconsin. It's relatively flat, and it was in October, I think, so all of the crops had been harvested, and the ground was literally just flat brown dirt with a few random trees and small hills. Anyway, there are 4 of us in the car, and it's probably like 10 p.m., so it's really dark. We see another car's headlights about a mile or so away from us, heading to the same 4-way intersection as us, but coming from the right, so if we were heading north, this car was moving east to west. As we get closer to the intersection, the car is getting closer, obviously, and is coming up to the stop sign for the intersection. As we get into the intersection, though, the car doesn't slow down at all. It speeds up, and it's heading right for us. We all turned and screamed and saw the headlights getting closer and closer, and right when they should have hit us, they vanished. We slammed on the brakes, got out of the car, and there was nothing. We could see for a mile or two in every direction, and the car just wasn't there. It's not like it was a drunk driver that went into a ditch, hit a tree, or just turned his lights off and kept going. The car was just gone. All 4 of us knew we saw it. We were all screaming and bracing for impact. Maybe it was mass hysteria or something, but a few months after this incident, the other 3 guys, and one other buddy, were back in their car, driving in the same area, and got T-boned by a drunk driver and were severely injured. I feel really lucky I wasn't in the car at that time, and while I'm sure it's just a weird coincidence, it creeps the hell out of me. I used to live in a house that backs up to a big public open space where there are hiking trails. There were lots of joggers and people walking their dogs. Anyway, one night I had a kind of creepy dream that an old lady came into my room and was trying to get me to come outside. The dream woke me up, so I got some water and turned off my fan because it was cold, and then I fell asleep again. I went right back into the same dream with this old lady coming into my room and calmly saying, "You have to go outside now." I kept telling her no, it was too cold. I woke up again, and my fan was on. I figured I must have just thought I turned it off or the button got stuck, so I got up, turned the fan off, and went back to sleep. This time, I had the exact same dream, except she was much older looking in this one and was really agitated. She was yelling, "Go outside. You must go outside." I got up in the dream and followed her to the hallway. When I got to the hallway, she wasn't there, and then I woke up and I was actually standing in the ducking hallway. I have never walked around in my sleep before or after this. Also, my fan was on when I went back to my room. At this point, I was freaked out, so I got something to eat and watched TV for a couple hours. I went back to bed around 5 or 6, and the dream didn't come back. The ducked up part is that a couple of days later, I saw that there were police cars in the open space, and when I asked my mom what happened, she said they had found an older woman who had been reported missing a few days before. She must have had a heart attack, a stroke, or something on the trail by my house, and they had found the body. I lived in one particular house a few years ago where we always suspected there was some sort of supernatural activity going on. We'd leave items in places, then come back to find them gone. We'd leave a room to find out the door had closed on its own. However, one incident topped all of these. I was lying in bed one night reading just before going to sleep when all of a sudden the room temperature seemed to drop, shortly followed by that gut feeling you get when you suspect that something isn't quite right. Curious as to why this all happened so suddenly, I lifted my head to scan the room to see what was up, only to encounter a large black hole situated at the foot of my bed, hanging slightly ajar from the far wall. I had no idea what the hell this thing was. I can only describe it as an absence of anything, like there was nothing there. It felt so cold and truly evil. Thankfully, Not being completely paralyzed by fear, I remembered reading somewhere once that ghosts, spirits, and whatever else can only mess with you if you invite them in, so I yelled at this thing to go away, "You're not welcome here," as well as other rude expletives. After a while, this thing converged in on itself, and that horrible feeling seemed to disappear along with it. I still have yet to explain what is most likely the strangest thing that's ever happened to me. I also once messed around with an Ouija board. Those things are really not as fun as everyone else puts them out to be. I was maybe 22, and my little brother and I were renting a house in a pretty bad neighborhood in Athens, Georgia. The house should have been condemned. Really old and had no AC with spiders living in the AC ducts, but we were both broke, so it was all we could afford at the time. Our landlord was extremely shady, and we would randomly come home to find him inside the house. Well, it was summertime in Georgia, so having no AC was a death sentence, so we bought 2 window unit ACs and both slept in the living room on air mattresses, so we would only have to air condition one room. We were both sleeping in the living room when I woke up at around 3:30 a.m. and happened to look towards my feet. There at the foot of my bed, silhouetted against the streetlights coming through the blinds of the huge living room window, was a tall, thin man in a suit and wide brim hat. I couldn't make out his face as it was all in shadow, but I could see he was smiling, and his eyes were glowing with a pale blue light. I said nope and rolled over to look away from what I was sure was a ghost, and he was instantly next to me, directly in my face, and had this wide, toothy grin on his face. I jumped back and yelled for my brother to wake up, "There's a ghost in our house," and he just kind of rolled over and told me to go back to bed. I looked back, and the hat man is gone. I sat outside on the front stoop the rest of the night, smoking. We moved out maybe a month later, and I never saw him again after that night. Not yet anyway, but I am always worried he'll come back.